Hi everyone, welcome to our session. I am Merve, connecting to this event from Istanbul, Turkey. I am the moderator of this session. So a little bit about myself. For the last 6 years, I've been leading the search of social innovators in Turkey and recently on the global level. We are thrilled to have you at our third Changemakers Summit on rediscovering certainty. As we go through the times of unprecedented change, I appreciate all of our efforts to be here, to rethink our past learnings and to hear from some of the most influential social innovators of our time. I know we are all exhausted by Zoom meetings and online gatherings, but I just appreciate all of you being here. I feel privileged to host one of the first sessions of the summit actually, and to introduce you three new and inspiring Ashoka Fellows from Europe. These fellows are reimagining justice, transparency, and fairness in all corners of the world. Welcome Ellen, John, and Shandor. So a little bit about our fellows. Ellen is joining Ashoka Fellowship from Switzerland this year. He is the founder of Civitas Maxima. Through his organization, he is building close partnerships with local NGOs and victim groups and enables them to systematically document all the international crimes that happened in their territory. They are then able to file complaints under universal jurisdiction, which grants these countries the power to prosecute perpetrators in local courts, regardless of their nationality. Ellen's model has shown great success at the case of Liberian War, engaging over 10,000 people in the process. Next one is John. John is joining the Ashoka Fellowship as a senior fellow from the United Kingdom. For those of you who might not be familiar with Ashoka Senior Fellowship, it's a specific category within the fellowship that's designed to recognize system-changing work of more seasoned social entrepreneurs, I would say. John founded Tax Justice Network in 2003 to tackle the tax invasion problem that resulted from the rapid growth of global capitalist economy. By creating new standards of tax regulation, mobilizing ambassadors from multiple sectors, and by reframing popular narratives around tax issues, John has led an holistic movement on the global level. And finally, Shandor, joining Ashoka Fellowship from Hungary. He is the founder of K-Monitor, an anti-corruption NGO that enables and empowers citizens, first to recognize the acts of corruption, and second to find points of intervention to stop such acts. To facilitate this process, K-Monitor organizes groups of volunteer hackers to utilize technological tools to help citizens make sense of the public data that is already available. I'd like to warmly welcome you all to our global network on behalf of the whole Ashoka community. Welcome again. In a minute, we'll dive into an insightful conversation with these three amazing fellows. But first, let me introduce you to my partner in crime, my colleague from Thailand, Varis, who will be helping me throughout this session. Varis, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, hello everyone, and I am so sorry for the technical difficulty, but thank you for your patience. As I said, 2020 wouldn't be complete without a little bit of tech difficulty in a Zoom meeting, so thank you for your patience and thank you for staying here with us today. And as Murray said, my name is Varis. I am your session coordinator today, so I'll make sure you make the most out of your sessions today. And if you have any question for our speakers, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And once Murray opened the floor to me, I'll make sure to pass along the question to our speakers. But before moving on to our main event, I would like to do a little bit of a energizer activities with all of us here. So if you can please head it to Menti page. I will send it in the chat shortly. It will help us get to know you a little more and, get a sense of, why you are here and what are your thoughts on our topics, the topics that we are going to talk about today. So please go to the Menti using the link provided or enter the code that is in the chat. Once you're there, there will be two prompts. One is a word cloud. The other one is, a statement which I would like you to rank your thoughts. So please, answer the question and then I'll share my screen and then we can see others' response as well. Okay. So what comes to mind when you hear the word justice? Fairness, intersectionality, transparency. Okay. What else? Okay. Equity, restorative, inequality, the lack of it, oversight, law, for the privilege. So much needed, of course. Injustice. Okay, fairness and equality seems like two big ones. Okay, opportunity, of course. Black Lives Matter. Equity. Okay, thank you. And let's move on to our next questions. Okay, there's still someone submitting answers. Thank you. Well, fairness, accountability, and equality seems like the three big words here. And as you can see, fairness is quite a big one here. Okay. So I see that some people still submitting their answer, but I would like to move on so that we have time for the sessions. Okay, please rate the following statement. I am passionate about creating justice for all. Well, looks like, you know, our sessions are full of passionate individual who wants to create justice for all. But in terms of solving corruption issues, the confidence level is around a 7. But then in terms of their beliefs that transparency is the key in building trust, we got a pretty high score of 9.3. Wow. So, okay. So hopefully after the sessions today, we can move some of those indicators a little bit. And without further ado, Merve, I would like to pass it back to you.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun because like it always feels weird to not being able to see the audience. So like I have a sense of the audience now. And I feel sorry for you, Shandor. People feel so negatively about resolving corruption. Sorry about that. Maybe I can start with you. This is such a difficult space, you know, like corruption, restoring justice, transparency, and as you can see, people are not feeling very hopeful of corruption. So why is this matter important to you? Why are you working on this issue?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session also from my side. Well, for me, the issue of corruption came with a very personal experiences, with personal experience when I was in university and in the neighborhood where I lived, a lot of very old, nice buildings were torn down and ugly ones were built instead. And the people who lived in the city or this part of the city had to move out. And I found it simply, you know, a very negative change and something that made me unhappy. And when looking after the background of these things, I figured out it's simply corruption because the local government is selling these buildings for nuts to friends. And these investors and developers then completely reshaped the city without, you know, taking care about the communities there and the interests of the society. So this is how my interest towards this issue came. I have not studied this topic before, and I felt as a young person back then that I need to do something against it. And it was the idea or the project which with our organization started, K-Monitor, was a database of corruption issues and public spending, so people could look up those stories, those people who were involved in such cases, because we were hoping that by flagging corruption and by raising awareness about corruption, people would less likely vote on corrupt politicians and be aware of, you know, what's happening around you. We also developed a mobile app where you could connect these cases to real spots in the city, so like a guide. So this is how we started. But basically, you know, I really felt bad about the fact that, you know, these public assets, the common good, things that belong to all of us, are wasted and spent in a not just way. And as a young people, a person, you probably have nothing to lose when you decide not to work for the government or go into business, but simply care about something that matters to you. And this is how our story started, and this was my connection or first connection to this issue.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to jump onto Ellen. You're also working in a very difficult environment, right? So you're working at places where international crime is currently happening. So what was your motivation?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm super happy to be here as well. It's interesting. I think, like Sandor, we are all informed by our personal experiences. So for me as a lawyer, I was very lucky, frankly, to be on trials which really had an impact on me. 2 trials of heads of state: the former president of Liberia, Charles Taylor, the former president of Chad, Hissène Habré, both convicted for war crimes, and the first trial in Phnom Penh, first Khmer Rouge trial in 2009. And in all those trials, I have seen firsthand, because I was in court, I have seen how important for victims of war crimes, of mass atrocities, how important it is for them to get justice, how they were able to move on with their lives, how it empowered them. And this is really had a very big impact on me. And of course, we all know in my field that impunity is not the exception, unfortunately, but impunity the norm. In other words, if you commit war crimes at a high level of command or high level politically, today, statistically, you have more chance not to be tried than to be tried. So this was my motivation, to try to build something, to create a network of independent lawyers for our children, great children, to live in a world where impunity is not the norm, but impunity becomes the exception.
Amazing. I just feel lucky to be living in a world that you also exist. John, how about you? How did you get into this business 20 years ago, I guess? You are muted.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Greetings from London, which of course is a great city, but is also the money laundering capital of the world. At least in my field it is. So I began in 1978. 1978, I had the good opportunity to talk with and interview a very famous professor from the London School of Economics, Susan Strange, her name was, and she gave me a truly astonishing figure. Now, at that time, I was working as a staffer with a global NGO called Oxfam, and I was looking at systemic roots of poverty, why poverty is actually embedded in the system. And Susan Strange said to me, look, just bear this in mind: for every dollar of aid that flows to the global south to help the poorer countries, at least $5 flows outwards, typically to the north, through offshore bank accounts, offshore trusts, offshore shell companies. And if you really want to understand why some of the most mineral-rich countries in the world are impoverished, you have to understand capital flight on this scale. And you have to do a deep dive into the world of tax havens. And that's where a little bit of personal history kicks in, because I grew up in the British Channel Island of Jersey, which of course is now a very prominent satellite tax haven of the City of London. So for me, it was a relatively easy job once I finished my training in investigation and so on, to go offshore and get a job in Jersey working with one of the major accounting firms. And from the inside, look at how this looting of Africa happened. And I was truly astonished when I started my investigation, working inside the offshore division of one of the big 4 accounting firms. I discovered that almost all of the clients were involved in criminal activities of one level or another, whether it was tax evasion or looting or illegal political payments or market rigging. you name it, avoiding creditors, hiding assets, you name it, it was going on. In fact, I didn't come across a single client who was not engaged in corrupt practices. And it was clear to me that I was working on the supply side of corruption, of corrupt practices. I was working in a big accounting firm, surrounded by lawyers and bankers and others, and all of them were colluding with corrupt practices. So I started to focus on the supply side and the way in which offshore shell companies and trusts and bank accounts are used, and the way in which the supply side has created a genuinely global criminogenic environment. So that was my background. Out of that came my work with the Tax Justice Network. I was invited by Oxfam and others to create the Tax Justice Network specifically to highlight the way in which globalization, particularly liberalization of financial markets, has created an enabling environment for corrupt practices.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing. So while preparing for this session, I was looking at all of your works, right? And I realized this shared value at the intersection of everything. Although you're working on systemic level, I just wanted to ask you this. How about the individual level? So the sense of justice within individuals. How do you see that playing a role in the act of corruption? Maybe John, can we continue with you? If you...
I'm muted again. Let's go back to 2005, 2006. I was engaged, I was working in Africa at the time. I was mapping how corrupt flows to offshore havens was actually impacting at ground level. And it became very clear to me that this affects individuals in so many ways. For example, if the wealthy elites and kleptocrats are looting the country's assets and shifting them offshore, that is a major obstacle to development. But if alongside that, they and the big companies and the business elites are evading paying taxes, that undermines the education systems, the health services. And the thing was that whilst talking to ordinary people in Africa, it was clear to me that they were very sensitized to this kind of corruption. In the global north, we're not sensitized to this kind of corruption. We're certainly not sensitized, or haven't until very recently been sensitized to the fact that it's the global north that provides the infrastructure, the financial infrastructure, which enables looting to happen on this kind of scale. And talking to ordinary people in Africa, they were kind of outraged by this. They knew exactly what was happening. They could see their leaders, their business leaders and their political leaders looting their countries. They could see the money disappearing off to Switzerland or to Miami or London or wherever it was going. They knew about this exactly. And yet the World Bank, in its battle against corruption, were actually pointing fingers at them and saying, you are the problem. Rather than pointing fingers the other way and saying this supply side has created a criminogenic environment. And they were outraged by this because they were the victims, and yet they were being blamed for it. And that was that inspired me, along with a few of my colleagues, to radically change the discourse around corruption. The corruption discourse from the mid-90s onwards was very much framed through the Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. And if you look at that index, the most corrupt countries are almost entirely in the global south, and the least corrupt countries almost entirely in the global north. And for what it's worth, that include places like Switzerland and United Kingdom, which of course is where all the money goes to in the end. So I said this discourse is upside down, and we created the Financial Secrecy Index to look at the way in which lack of transparency has completely has created this criminogenic environment and completely corrupted so many areas of human activity. But it's so clear to people in Africa how corruption affected their lives, and so clear to them that corruption was being supported by a global infrastructure, a financial infrastructure, And yet, for some reason or other, we in the North have been very blind to this. And I think that's been a large part of my project, which has been to expose the way in which the global North has created this enabling, corrupting environment.
Speaking of international sphere of things, like I just wanted to ask the same question to Shandor about like local effects of things. So like when your own government is stealing money from you, how do you feel about it? And like how do people in Hungary take corruption on a personal level?
Well, let me start with connecting a bit to what John said, because this even exists, I mean, this principle within Europe. I mean, Hungary is, let's say, a rather developing country in the European Union. And you see clearly how, let's say, Western multinational companies are treated in a very special way by our government. And these companies fully tolerate, let's say, a rising authoritarian power in the heart of Europe because they can make good business. And the whole system of injustice also starts, I would say, at this point. And you know what you see as a citizen is that, let's say, billions of euros are spent on development within Europe, and those people who would really need, let's say, better infrastructure or better education or better healthcare to build up the country fit for the future, they simply don't get it, and the money is wasted and stolen, either wasted or stolen, depending whether it's simply lack of capabilities to spend it in a wise way, or because the government is building its clientele. And this is clearly visible to citizens when you see, you enter a Hungarian hospital and see that it looks like 30, 40 years ago, and the service you get, cannot be as good. And you see the, I don't know, 15th new stadium being built because that's the hobby of the prime minister. And it's a complete injustice of how money is distributed or how decisions are made, that people are considered as not grown-ups but kids, and the government decides everything instead of them. And the corruption then goes down to the very basic level where the political issue is not even relevant, but the whole mentality of corrupt governance is visible. And this is, I would say, an issue all around the globe. And again, Western countries, I mean, it was a big issue in the United States when it turned out that celebrities paid bribes for their kids to getting to colleges where they would normally not be accepted. And then you have the direct effect, because those who, based on merit, would be able to enter don't have a place in the school because it was given to someone. And it can become even deadly when it comes, let's say, to the healthcare sector, and the person doesn't get an organ transplantation because someone else had the money to pay to get it first, or had a good connection to a certain doctor. So from this really micro level to global tax issues, it's present everywhere in our lives. And I think it really can destroy trust into the institutions and the system and in each other, that erodes then democracy and the fiber of a healthy community.
Thank you. I'm gonna turn to Ellen, but it's like I've been avoiding it. It's kind of tricky in your case, right? Because all of these war criminals, actually we have a question on the chat, they're asking if you see remorse in some of these criminals, right? So they're like basically acting over people's lives. And how do you see justice in that field? In most of the cases, we see the criminals just blaming it's on the system, they're like, I was ordered to do so, so I did so. So have you had a chance to contemplate on justice, people's feeling of justice, and how do they overcome it when they are committing such crimes, basically?
Yeah. I was only one time in my life in a case where we thought that the alleged war criminal was basically pleading guilty, was basically asking for forgiveness. This was in Cambodia. At the end, he changed his plea at the last minute. But it's true, it's quite uncommon. I wanted to say that I feel very, very close to what has been said by John and Sandor. And me, I can see many links between the fight against corruption and the fight against impunity. In a way, in a country where you have very, very strong rule of law, then I think if you don't try to corrupt a police officer when you get a speeding ticket, or if you don't try to murder your neighbor because he's noisy and you don't like him, I think the common feature is because you know that somehow you will be caught and somehow we are not going to get away with it. And I think this is the problem we face. And I think it's very, very interesting in the work of John to look at the global north, because I can see even with war crimes, you would think a bit maybe like what John you said about corruption, and you say, oh, all the north is not corrupt, all the south is corrupt. You could say, oh, all the north people in Europe don't commit war crimes, and in many other countries in other continents they commit war crimes. And then we are working actually on the complicity of Western businessmen who in Africa are bringing the weapons, are getting the minerals from those countries to get rich in Europe. So I think it's the same effort to try to find not only the problem in the north, but very much as well. And you talk many times about Switzerland, and I think you are right to do so. So for me, really the antidote to corruption, to this commission of war crime and the impunity is the rule of law. And this is, I think, the common thread, the common between the three of us. We're trying to do something about strengthening the rule of law.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm just gonna turn back to the audience. Do we have any specific questions from the audience? Maybe if you can take one or two of them.
Yes, sure. So the first question is from Laura Zuccaro, and she asks, how does one help individuals to flag corruption in difficult environments and stay safe?
I guess that's is it for John or Sandor?
It's for anyone.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to begin and say, look, it's absolutely crucial that we don't encourage people to take heroic decisions or heroic positions which might lead to them either endangering themselves or endangering people around them. I work a lot with journalists, and in fact have a journalist training program which has worked brilliantly out of London, but it's global. Journalists are a key part of this, and one of the key things is to learn how to effectively work with journalists, because journalists tell stories, but journalists aren't brilliant in that they don't know everything there is to know. They need to have solid evidence. They need to have reliable people, and so I think working as a network, the great success of the Tax Justice Network is that we have worked very effectively with journalists to explain very complex issues involving, in many cases, global rules that have failed, and yet, the journalists will find ways of telling the story through the personal angles, and I think that's a very good way of getting involved. I certainly wouldn't necessarily invite you to kind of take any heroic positions unless you are very well protected, as we do within our network. We are very careful to protect one another.
I completely agree with what John said. I think, and this is also our experience, that journalists are the ones that are, capable of investigating such stories, publishing it, and then, you know, results can be expected. But not only that, publicity means also protection. It's much, much harder to go after a person once, you know, the whole country knows about the story than if it's, you know, an individual, you know, hidden in a village and completely, you know, up to the decisions of the employer or a mayor and so on. And I would also add another issue which connects to the rule of law topic mentioned by Alan. I mean, you know, countries should and really must have whistleblower protection laws and infrastructure to protect those who report crimes, who report wrongdoings for the good of the community, and make sure that, you know, these people don't experience any harm or retaliation just because they speak up for any kind of wrongdoing or injustice.
Thank you. Can we take the next question, Varis?
Yes, sure. So the next question is from, I'm sorry if I pronounced this incorrectly, Yesim. Trusting to the government are low, as we saw in the Mentimeter poll. And I observed that civil and youth are becoming more apolitical with this trust issue, and in Turkey especially. What do you think about this, and what is your observations?
Can I quickly start here, because I think it's a very important question. And when Alan was raising the rule of law as, you know, an important antidote, I would add another one, which is participation and citizens' involvement in, you know, decisions over a community. What we saw in Hungary is that, you know, the system of checks and balances, the system of rule of law was dismantled. And in this case, you know, what still can protect, if there is courage among citizens, if they feel strongly connected to the communities, if they feel that the institutions in the country are their own, and it's worth protecting it. So I think it's extremely important in reestablishing trust to open up government, to make it transparent and allow citizens to, you know, especially on the local level, especially in issues that are really everyday matters, to connect to the institutions, to have a say themselves, to decide in many areas, and to be consulted in decisions. I think the whole lack of trust, which, you know, is very strongly connected, I think, to corruption, is also in connection with, you know, the crisis of democracy as we face it now, and how, you know, democracy needs to be reformed. And I believe, you know, if we can reform the system of democracy, or how democracy works, that will have a strong effect on the fight against corruption, and also will be able to, you know, increase trust in institutions.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this is very important point. And I think it's true that we see this lack of trust everywhere in many countries. And frankly, sometimes it's just because the way the government or the politicians are behaving, hence this lack of trust. And now many, not only young people, but many people are now feeling, you know, they don't just trust the government. And the answer, of course, and I think this is a very important point, the answer should be not for the people not to do anything and to say, well, we cannot trust the government, let them do whatever they want. Of course not. And the important is this is why I'm so excited to join Ashoka, to have a global network of people who believe that change can be done at the individual level, then connecting together, and then bringing social changes. And frankly, again, we see it again as well in the field of war crimes. If you have impunity in a country and a government doesn't want to set up a war crimes court and does nothing against the people who are in the country committed crimes, they are not tried. Well, I mean, if it's possible, of course, in some countries it's too dangerous, but if it's possible, then mobilization should exist at the local level in order to force and request the government to act and end impunity. I think this is a very, very important point.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for the questions. I'm going to cut it here. At the end, we're going to have another 5-10 minutes for the questions. I'm going to continue with my questions. Maybe I'm corrupted myself. Actually, because like it ties greatly to the answers you just gave to the last question. So like, I wanted to ask you, what kind of opportunities do you see in the current system? The world is going through this enormous change with COVID, with far-right movements rising, with polarization increasing. What kind of opportunities do you see in this very problematic world of ours? Ellen, would you like to continue?
Yes, with pleasure. I mean, I want to tell you a story which shows how indeed this global, what we are living now is really complicated and in a way unprecedented. I had the luxury to do a master's degree at Columbia University in New York, and this was in 2002. And in 2002, we had been, this was the year the International Criminal Court was set up. And since 1993, the creation of the Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, then 94, Rwanda, up to 2002, there has been incredible improvement with all these war crime courts and all this global movement against impunity, culminating to this incredible, if you think about that, incredible hope of a permanent criminal court able, with an independent prosecutor, able to indict a sitting head of state for war crimes. I mean, this was extraordinary. And I remember thinking in New York in 2002, I remember thinking, well, if things keep going that way, in 20 years, so 22, so almost now, there will be no impunity for war crimes. This will be done. We will have won. There will be, in a world where the progress will be absolute, there will be no impunity for war crimes. And here we are in 2020 with the current administration in the United States, which is threatening of sanction the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. So they are treating as criminals the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. You have sitting heads of state talking about commission of widespread crimes. So we are in an unprecedented backlash in our field, where we are wondering whether one day just the fact to prosecute a war criminal will still be or not possible. And I think that this is in those times where people understand that the very notion of rule of law for those crimes is under threat, frankly, that there is a lot of energy because a lot of people, including donors, understand that a lot now it is at stake, as in corruption field and other anti-corruption field and others. So really in our field, I think there is a great sense that this is the time to basically work even harder and get together in order to fight for the future, because otherwise I think not only war crimes will not be tried, but war crime could be committed anywhere. So I think there is this awakening now. And for that reason, I'm optimistic and not pessimistic.
I guess that's a key habit of Ashoka Fellows, right? I wanted to give the stage to John because I felt like your answers will be connected on this issue.
Yeah, they will. I'm also optimistic, but I think we are at a fascinating and dangerous moment. We're facing multiple crises. We're facing a climate crisis. We're facing global debt crisis. Obviously, we have the COVID crisis. We have a sustained attack on democracy coming from national populists on the right wing, the solutions lie with a kind of re-understanding of why international cooperation really matters. And I think that's the key thing. In the area where I'm working, I'm perhaps a little bit guided by the fact that 20 years ago, when we started working around some of the transparency measures that we were pushing for country-by-country reporting standards for global companies, automatic information exchange between tax authorities, public registers of beneficial ownership information of offshore companies. these things were regarded as totally utopian. In fact, I was told by the head of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, these wouldn't happen in my lifetime. Well, I'm alive and they're now the global standards. So it is possible for civil society to make move very fast. And I think that the incoming administration in the US is going to be more internationally minded than its predecessor administration. I hope the US will recognize and Joe Biden has said the US must now reclaim some kind of leadership role in the international community. I would welcome that, because I think then the absence of a leader has created chaos. But I think that there's a recognition, and he has said this in the past. And by the way, I met Joe Biden in 2005, and we discussed this at some length. He said that tackling the global corruption will be one of the priorities, and I think he understands that, because he understands that democracy itself is undermined by the corruption, the kind of corruptions that we're talking about. And I also want to link up very quickly to what Alain said about security. It is quite clear that corruption at this level has massively harmed national and international security. And I think that's an agenda that needs to be opened up more and explored fully. The extent to which corrupt money flows, for example, have entered democracy and entered election processes and entered the media is genuinely frightening, and I think that's an area where we must take a lead in pushing back.
Shandor, what do you think?
I would first remember that progress in history has never been steady. So that means that of course, there are periods when there's a return or a backwards trend, and I think we're living in these times at the moment. It's just going downwards, but it doesn't mean that it won't get better, or we cannot change that. I think one opportunity is to understand why this is happening, and how systems have changed to the worse, and learn from it how to do it better. I think there are a lot of new ways that we can exploit for our own benefit, and here I mean the society. Technology, as it is both a threat or a real danger, it's also a great opportunity to connect people, to make things transparent, to make things faster happen. We need to learn much more of how we can exploit technology for the good, and not only use the negative aspects or suffer from the negative aspects of it, which are definitely there. I also see that more and more people are longing for political change. It's just that it's not that we would not know how to do things better, but it's so difficult to make the change happen. And this is again, I think this great belief in many people that they want to change things for the better and for the good. And my belief that people are basically good gives, I think, a great resource to start change. It's just we have a hard time in finding the ways and the tools, but it's good to see that there's so many people around the globe who try and, let's say, have little pilot projects in bringing about change. And hopefully from these little projects and sometimes bigger projects, those trends will evolve that will turn us to the good direction and change the world for the better, and in a way that really those billions of people who live on this planet can have a good life and a just life.
I'm so glad we are having a conversation. Four optimists here having a conversation. Most of the time I think the same, like given the right environment and right tools, people would just act upon the injustices, and hopefully it's gonna happen soon. I just want to turn back to audience again. If you have any other questions, I'm seeing like lots of things all over the chat.
Yes, there are
from different people this time.
Yes, there are so many questions, and I'm sorry, participants, if I cannot select all. I'll make sure to pass the one that we're not answering to the speakers, and you can connect with the speakers on Swapcard. So let's start with the first one. So this one is about journalism. So I'm going to pass that to John because you mentioned about forming alliance with journalism. So in Colombia, the question is from Daniela de la Rioja. In Colombia, main journalist magazine with investigation backgrounds are turning to more viral polarizing news, preferred over research-based ones. So what can we do to foster the good journalism back?
I recognize that problem because this is a lot of this is to do with media ownership, and out of the emerging technologies, we're now beginning to see new solutions to the problems of concentrated media ownership, often belonging to billionaires who frankly have an agenda which might be questionable. And I think we need to look to new models, and I've seen quite a number of new models of journalism. In fact, I've taken part in some of the new models of journalism, which I think point in the direction of a better future for journalism. In particular, there's a group of investigating journalists in France who work under the banner of Mediapart, and this is a cooperatively owned newspaper where it's the readers who contribute to the running of the newspaper, and they decide its editorial policies and which stories are going to be going to run. And I think that's a very, very interesting and possibly encouraging model for the future. It's not so much, I think, that there aren't some fantastic investigating journalists out there, but the problem is that in too many cases, current media owners are not prepared to pay for the kind of awesome investigative journalism that is required in this area. I've been personally involved with many of the really big stories coming out around, for example, Panama Papers. I was very deeply involved in that, in the global investigation, and more recently the Paradise Papers leaks coming out of Bermuda. And in those cases, what was interesting was the extent to which, whereas in the past, investigative journalists had worked very much as lone wolves, chasing their own stories and not sharing, in these cases, we saw very close cooperation across many different media in many different countries, involving upwards of 400 journalists working together with an agreed timeline and agreed embargo date, and working very effectively together. And I think that kind of journalism also helps to tackle corruption, because so many of the corrupt practices are cross-border and therefore require some kind of cross-border cooperation. So again, I'm reasonably optimistic, but we are living in that period between the old order of journalism and the new order of journalism and new order of media. And at the moment, there are far too many monsters lurking out there spreading really bad stories.
Great, thank you. One last question, only one. I'm sorry.
Oh, only one. Okay. Then let me get the question for all. This is from Michaela Finish. And the question is that, how do we help the social impact world see that corruption is a barrier to everyone's efforts and make it an agenda relevant for everyone? So I think this is a question for all.
Please go ahead. I'm not gonna call names.
I'll start then. So I think, one interesting aspect of corruption is that it's almost all the time about the conflict between your selfish or individual gain and the gains for the community. So I think all kinds of activities with which you make your community better, and it can really be only the building you're living in, or if it's a block of flats, or the street where you live, but it can be the city or a country, whatever, a community of people. If your action makes this community better, and it's about, you know, building it stronger, that's for me an effort that, you know, fights corruption, because I think this fiber of communities and society needs to be strengthened to fight back corruption, or don't let it even happen. And in societies which are based on greed, selfishness, you know, only following your own interest or only the interest of a very particular group against other groups, this is where I think, you know, nothing else matters than power, than bringing forward your own agenda against the agenda of others, without dialogue and so on. And this is where corruption happens. So I don't think that you need to be specifically an anti-corruption activist to be able to fight, you know, those thoughts or those activities that at the end lead to a corrupt system. It's about being active in the community and doing whatever things that make it better or help it to thrive.
Alan, please, small contribution if possible.
Yeah, of course. No, again, I feel so close with what was just said. And again, there are some links with my field, because Sandor talked about trust among people, and you know, you see in war crimes many times when things happen is because politicians are able to define some groups are the enemy against other groups, and this is how everything is starting. And I think the same way people have to trust their government, but if it doesn't exist, I think people have to trust themselves, and groups have to trust themselves and can come together. So again, I maybe I should have worked on anti-corruption issues. I feel very close to what has just been said.
Changing careers in the meanwhile, or maybe one day you can all collaborate. John, if it's all right with you, I would like to move on to my final question, actually, because it's a call to action to everyone. I just wanted to ask you, as regular citizens listening to this conversation, what can we do? How can we support your movement?
I think the starting point, as with all these things, is to get a better understanding of the subject. In my case, I think I've said to everybody that they watch a film. It's available free on YouTube. It's called The Spider's Web. I co-produced it. And it's a deep dive into the world in which I've been kind of working and living for the last 40 years or so, and certainly I think you might get a better understanding of where of my focus on the supply side of corruption. But I think we need to understand that, you know, in most countries, the institutions, all of the institutions of democracy, whether it's journalists or journalism, the media, or the judiciary, or the regulatory authorities, or the auditors, and so on, all of these institutions need strengthening. Corruption has dug very deep in most countries, and we need to kind of rethink and re-strengthen the institutions which protect us from corruption.
Sandor, any ideas?
I think what I replied to the previous question is what I wanted to actually say say here. It's, you know, just again, if you have a broken light bulb in your flat, you change it probably because you don't see it, disturbs you. If you go out on the street and you see a broken street light, think whether, you know, do you have any duties with that, raising, flagging it, or and this is, again, do something good for your community, or at least ask yourself every day, what have I done for my community?
Thank you. Alan?
Yes, I mean, for us, there is something very concrete going on, because in 2 weeks, I will be in court. We have here in Switzerland a war crime trial where I am the one who filed a criminal complaint against an alleged mid-level commander of Liberian nationality who would be tried here in Switzerland for war crimes. And it's quite an incredible trial because, believe it or not, but in 2020, it will be the first ever war crime trial in Switzerland in front of the Federal Criminal Court here. And it will be the first ever trial against a Liberian gentleman accused of war crimes. And the war ended in 2003, started in 1989. And only now in 2020, there will be this first war crime trial. So I would invite people to go on our website. We will do trial monitoring. We will do many things to try to get the word. And it's interesting beyond Switzerland and Liberia, because I think the more these efforts are going on, with victims coming all the way in spite of COVID to come here to testify. In 2014, we started, there was Ebola, now there is COVID. So I feel this victim will have overcome everything to find justice. So the more these efforts are known and spread and the world is shared, the more we will be able to do that somewhere else.
Bravo, Alain.
I'm so moved. I'm just gonna jump on the first flight to
Not done yet. It's not done yet.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I would like to express my gratitude for the speakers for sharing your wisdom and experience with all of us. I'd like to thank all of the listeners for joining us today, and I'd like to thank all of them specifically for keeping the conversation alive on Swapcard. I really appreciated that. I'm sorry that we couldn't cover all the questions, but I would like to invite our speakers to visit the chat after this conversation and maybe answer some of the questions they can. I would like to thank my colleagues, first of all, Varis, for being my partner in crime for the last 1 hour, besides all the technical difficulties. And then I would like to thank Ashoka's venture team, who found and recruited these amazing fellows. So thank you, Emily, Nicole, Jolt, Alessandro, Todd, Yannick, and Marie for adding these great fellows to our community. Before we all head off to the next session, I'd like to stress the relevance of these ideas to today's problems. As we mentioned, the problems are mostly global nowadays, but the solutions can also be global, and we'll be working with Ashoka Fellows to scale their work on a systemic level and on the international level, basically. And for those of you who would like to find more about this issue, there is another session tomorrow on corruption. It's at 4 p.m. Central European Time. Expert of the field will be discussing how corruption affects the Sustainable Development Goals and what kind of solutions have been made available. I would recommend you to join that session as well. And as a final note, to repeat Marie Ringler's words from the video, it is now the time to act, and we believe Ashoka is well positioned to make your contribution matter. Please consider donating if you have the resources. Talk to us in the Ashoka booth if you see an opportunity to start a partnership with us, and nominate candidates to become Ashoka Fellows in the nomination chat. And I say goodbye. Thank you all.